So I was super excited to get my hands on this camera when Sony contacted me, and being one of the first people to be able to use it was a huge honor. So I'm happy to report that in all honesty, this camera has exceeded my expectations, even in difficult real-world shooting. I was given the opportunity to make a short film in basically any way that I wanted, and what I wanted to do was see how it performs out in nature. So my girlfriend Kobe and I went out and we went to a bunch of different locations. We filmed in the rain, we filmed in low light, we filmed in sandy conditions, we filmed high action running scenes, and the camera really performed amazingly no matter what I threw at it. So I'm going to break down some of my experiences shooting with the A7S III for you now. So the first thing I noticed when I started using it was compatibility. I have the Sony A7 III, I had the Sony A7R III before it, and a whole bunch of Sony lenses and accessories, and they all still work on the A7S III. So the upgrade was painless, and that's so important to me with the new camera. The A7S III has improved a lot of features on the previous cameras, and the main feature to me that was the most important was 10-bit 422 internal recording. It's so important for me that this is internal and not external, recorded out to an external recorder, because I'm shooting on a gimbal almost all the time, and I'm also shooting a lot in difficult weather conditions. And in those kinds of scenarios, it's really hard to keep an HDMI cable connected and a monitor attached to it at all times. It slows me down to operate that way, and it dissuades me from doing some of the more adventurous shots that I might want to do when mounted up on a gimbal with a lighter camera. I am a run and gun shooter, which means I need a camera that I can just pick up out of my backpack and start shooting with without having to rig up a big cage and a bunch of accessories. Because if I have to slow down to do all those extra steps, I'm gonna miss the shot. And another feature that's super important to me as a run and gun shooter is in-body image stabilization, also known as IBIS. And the IBIS on the A7S III has been improved. They've added active mode. Now this mode is mostly useful for when you're trying to get a static shot with a telephoto lens. There is a bit of crop in active mode, which you should be aware of, but to me, the crop was well worth it to get those shots as steady as I got them. For my gimbal shots, I switched back to standard image stabilization, which worked better for shots with a lot of panning, tilting, and other camera movement, because gimbals aren't perfect, especially when you're walking on rough terrain, so that standard image stabilization was good enough to smooth those bumps out and give me glassy smooth gimbal movements. Another feature that's super important to run and gun shooters is the autofocus, and the A7S III has improved it quite a bit. There's touch to track autofocus on the LCD screen of the camera and using the Imaging Edge app. Additionally, one really cool thing about the autofocus now is that it intelligently chooses the method of tracking that it uses. So for instance, you can start by touching to track your subject, and then when it detects the face of your subject, it will switch over to face detection. And if your subject gets close enough to camera that both eyes can't stay in focus, then it will switch over to eye detection autofocus, and it will choose an eye and focus on that eye for you. So it's very intelligent the way it chooses to focus. It won't accidentally focus on your subject's nose instead of the eye. And this is really, really important when you're working with super shallow depth of field and when you don't have a dedicated person pulling focus for you. When I'm shooting on a gimbal, I can't also be pulling focus. It's just too many things to do at once. So being able to trust the A7S III to do that for me in most situations is really valuable. And one thing that I found super impressive is that the autofocus actually still worked even by moonlight. When I was filming Kobe out in the desert under a full moon, I wanted to do this shot that started way back behind her with the moon up in the sky and then pushed into her face, rotating around her body. This is a difficult kind of shot for any autofocus system, and the A7S III was actually able to handle it pretty well, especially considering I was shooting at ISO 8000 and the only source of light was the moon. 4K 120p is a big, big feature of this camera, and I used it quite a bit on the shoot because for the first time, I'm able to record at 120p with no loss in image quality, because it records 4K 10-bit 422 with minimal crop. It's only a 1.1x crop on the image, and you get to keep your face detection and your eye detection in your autofocus. The autofocus is just as good in 4K 120p as it is in 24p. Most other cameras in this class can't claim that. They either turn off the autofocus or they cripple it somehow, or there's a heavy crop when you go into the higher frame rates. So instead of having to be my own focus puller, I can remain in the role of director and shooter, which is where I want to be. Rolling shutter. Rolling shutter has always been the bane of my existence shooting on mirrorless cameras, because if you pan the camera too fast, you get those really amateur looking slanted lines. Bad rolling shutter is one of the giveaways that you're not shooting on a real cinema camera, because mirrorless cameras tend to have a lot more rolling shutter than something like a Red or an Alexa would. Since the rolling shutter is so minimal now, you can use this camera for a lot of high action kind of shooting that a mirrorless camera wouldn't have been able to handle in the past. So operationally speaking, there was a lot that I just didn't have to really worry about when using the S3. The autofocus was great, the camera never overheated, and it has weather sealing. Now I didn't push the weather sealing to its absolute limit. I did put a plastic bag over the camera when it started raining heavily, but a lot of water did still end up getting on the camera. The rainstorm was over 2 weeks ago, which means that the camera would probably be starting to have operational problems by now if there was corrosion inside. And the fact that it works perfectly means that probably no water got inside the body of the camera and it's fine. Okay, color rendition. I like colors that look natural. And in that regard, I was really happy with what I got out of the S3. And the dynamic range is excellent on this camera. Even when shooting outdoors in contrasty scenes, I had no trouble keeping Kobe properly exposed while also retaining detail in the sky. I recorded this short film actually in standard mode with picture profile off, highlights turned all the way down to -9, shadows cranked all the way up to +9 to give myself the maximum dynamic range possible. I also enabled dynamic range optimization, which is called DRO, and I turned down the sharpness all the way down to -7 so I could add it back in post if I felt it was necessary. So those were my settings, and based on those settings, I was able to get an image that almost didn't need any adjustment in post at all. So the color that you saw in the short film is almost exactly what came straight out of the camera. And that's the way I usually work. I like to get things right in camera so I don't have to adjust them too much in post. But if you want to have the absolute most control over your image possible, you can shoot in log. And because it is 10-bit 422, you have the full spectrum. You're not going to have blockiness, you're not going to have banding or any of those issues with this camera. It has S-Log3, S-Log2, all the cine profiles, HLG, whatever you need. It's all internal on the S3. I do want to talk about low light noise a bit because the A7S III is not noise free. There is noise in the image even at relatively low ISOs. And you're still going to see this noise even if you use S-Log3. I believe you get the same level of noise from the sensor regardless of your picture profile. So I don't know exactly what's causing it with this noise, but I found that as long as the subject of your scene is not in the shadows, then you can go to super high ISOs and it will still look great. But if your subject is in the shadows, if it's in the toe of that exposure curve, you will have noise issues when you try to raise things up in post. So what I did in post was I added a luminance mask to my noise reduction so that it only reduced noise in the shadows of the image. And I applied the noise reduction at the minimum amount to make the noise bearable to my eyes. And the image ended up coming out looking very clean. Editing my footage from the S3 was overall a breeze because it records in an all-intra format. Basically, if your machine can handle ProRes, it can handle what comes out of the A7S III. So I was able to cut my 24p and my 60p footage without transcoding, even with multiple layers, even with some color correction effects on it. When I was recording 120p, it was a different story. It is much, much more compressed and has to be unpacked by the computer. So I wasn't able to play back my 120p footage smoothly. I had to transcode it. I just selected my clips, I chose optimized footage, went to bed, and when I woke up the next morning, all my clips were replaced by their optimized versions and I was able to cut through them like butter. I didn't touch on recording sound at all, but the S3 does have 4 channels of internal audio recording, which means if you use an XLR input and connect that to some sort of a device that has 4 inputs, Sony actually makes one, then you can record from 4 sources and keep them all as discrete channels in your footage, which is another professional feature that was missing from previous A7 cameras. So I think that's a great thing that they've added to the S3. I just haven't really had a chance to use it yet. I had a total blast shooting with the A7S III, and I have no reservations about recommending it to anybody who wants to shoot cinematic footage in a run and gun style. So thanks again to Sony for this opportunity, and I look forward to using this camera for my own filmmaking for many years to come. In this course, you're going to learn the run and gun filmmaking techniques that I've developed over years of practice. And you'll learn how to apply your photography skills toward making great videos. We're going to start with the basics. Here you'll learn how to set up your camera and do basic camera movements, both handheld and on a gimbal. Then I'll teach you how to direct an actor and do basic scene coverage so that you'll be able to shoot a complete scene that cuts together smoothly. Then we'll get into the really fun stuff like complex gimbal moves, shooting out on the street, field audio, and hyperlapses. You'll learn some specialty skills like filming a moving vehicle, action sports, and drone filmmaking. Then the shooting lessons will finish with improvised portraits and a party on the beach, where you'll learn some important skills for low light shooting. Then it's on to editing, where I'll show you the methods I've developed so I can effortlessly work with any amount of footage. First, you'll learn how to import and organize your clips. Then, you'll learn to create string outs, scenes, and master projects. Then I'll take you step by step through each scene in the film, showing you exactly how I put it together, and most importantly, why I made my creative decisions. Filmmaking is storytelling, and learning to tell a story with the edit is the most important skill of all. I'll show you how I add sound effects and music, and then we'll do some finishing touches like color correction, audio level mastering, and export. So through the making of this short film, you'll learn essential video skills that have taken me years of real-world practice to develop. So I hope you're excited. Let's go ahead and get started.